So you've got two different levels there of needs that you're trying to address. What kinds of issues do you seem to bring up first in these kinds of assessments? What sort of remediation issues come up fairly regularly?
I think the focus of most of our assessment, like I mentioned earlier, is checking to see if they have a good foundation of a cybersecurity program. And it's almost like analogous to a house. Before you build a house, you want to make sure that you have a solid foundation on which to build upon. And what we have seen is that a lot of these companies, they do ad hoc projects instead of worrying about building the right foundation. So that's some of the challenges we face, because a lot of the companies think of it as a soft side of security. So they don't want to focus as much. Things like, having the right policies or having the right procedures, having a good training program, things of that nature, which I consider the bedrock of a good foundational program. Some of these companies, they feel like, having the right firewall or having some sexy technology is the way to go. So those are some of the challenges I feel, at least, to educate them to say, hey, building the right, the foundation of a cybersecurity program is as important as having a new or sexy technology in your environment.
So it sounds like they're looking for specific fixes and they're focusing on individual kinds of items as opposed to setting that foundation first and then building on that.
Correct.
So you do your assessment, you leave your report. Do you ever get into situations where you're called back to an organization for essentially the same kinds of issues, to address the same kinds of issues again?
Well, there are two types of calls we're getting. One is, when we leave the recommendations behind, the audit committees, the boards are kind of asking the executives, look, you gave us an update a year ago or 2 years ago. Where do we stand on our cyber program today? So that kind of drives what I call the reassessment of their program. So in some cases, we go out there and we really find quite a bit of improvements. Whereas in some cases, we see that the recommendations we made a year or 2 years ago, nothing has been done, and we kind of follow on to that again and kind of identify and recommend it again.
Okay, which is kind of troubling. So if you go back to an organization, the board has been involved and they want to see where things are at. So management calls you in to do another assessment and you're finding the same kinds of things. Why is that? What are some of the drivers for them not making the recommended improvements from the first report?
I think, Jay, you and I have been in this business long enough to know that human nature is such that, we tend to do the things which is a little easier to do or doesn't require much work. And, the projects which take a long time to accomplish, or projects which are cross business units or political in nature or require a lot of feedback or input from other businesses, not just within your own security group, for example. Those are typically the projects we notice which are kind of left and not get addressed from our one assessment to the other. For example, data classification is one thing. Everybody wants to do it. They kind of have identified in their policies, what type of classification. But in terms of rolling out and actually identifying the assets which are classified or not, that entails a fairly lengthy exercise in terms of each department going through their assets and really tagging those assets for the appropriate classification. So that's kind of one area where we see a repeat, where it says, we kind of started it, we updated the policy, but then later on, we started getting involved with other business unit and it slowed down and it never took off. So that's sort of the one side of things where there is a cross-department need to get a project done. The others, they're just technically complex projects. For example, one thing comes to my mind is identity access management. People undertake that project knowing that they can automate the provisioning, the deprovisioning, and as you know, majority of the regulations require access reviews, and to make it easier to get the access reviews done, they undertake this identity access management project, but then it kind of stalls because the roles are not defined properly. Then they have to kind of create the roles again, or they didn't build the architecture properly, but just delve right into product selection and implementing the product without knowing where the gold source of information is and things of that nature. So I think those are some of the reasons we are seeing that we see a repeat recommendations coming from our reassessments.
Yeah, you mentioned identity and access management, which is an essential foundational issue, but also the data classification. And in the company I came from, we called it knowing where our crown jewels are.
Right.
And unless you can identify where those are, it's really tough to protect them, right?
Exactly.
So without those foundations, companies can get into a situation fixing this issue and this issue, what they call the whack-a-mole sort of approach. And what you're proposing is something more foundation, something more lasting, something that would not keep recurring back year after year after year. So that's critically important.
Exactly.
So you mentioned a couple of reasons why these recommendations are not added: complexity, working across business units, tendency to address things that are most easy to fix, and it's a kind of a human nature thing. Anything else come to mind in the assessments that you've done where it looks like you've identified some other causes why these things aren't getting completed?
I think some of the other reasons we're also seeing is that either there's a change in leadership. So for example, one CISO leaves, or CISO, which is Chief Information Security Officer, leaves, and another one comes in, and that person has a different approach to things. For example, instead of following one framework like a NIST 853, they want to follow an ISO framework. So a little bit of changes occur from that angle. Or instead of doing a data classification in terms of one way, they want to do a way where they can tag a metadata to each of the assets, the gold source we talked about. So the kind of project takes a different angle. And sometimes it just gets not addressed because there are other regulatory pressures the companies start to face, and the focus kind of shifts to the regulatory compliance rather than undertaking some of the projects they should have been doing as part of our recommendation. So for example, last year, the New York finance cyber law came out where they're requiring now companies with finance, insurance, and other professional services which companies provide that they have to deal with and address to the cyber law and cyber requirements by, I believe, this year, 2018. So that's why, the focus kind of shifts and some of the projects get delayed.